Everyone at the funeral cried for him. A devoted husband. A tragic accident. A life cut short. But 3 months later, someone saw him. Alive. In another city. With another woman. Spending the money his grieving wife received after his death. The truth? He didn't die. He disappeared. And built a brand new life with her money. Robert Calloway grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, the second of 4 children in a household that his father, a man named Cheryl Calloway who worked in construction management, ran with the particular combination of high expectation and inconsistent presence that produces in some children a sustained drive to perform and in others a sustained drive to appear to perform without the underlying substance. Robert fell into the second category, which was not immediately obvious because the appearance of performance, when done well, is difficult to distinguish from the actual thing in the short term, and Robert Calloway had understood from a relatively early age that the short term was the unit of time he was most comfortable operating in. He was charming in the specific way that people are charming when they have learned early that charm is the most efficient tool available for producing the response they want from the people around them, not the charm of someone who is genuinely warm and engaging, though he could produce that impression, but the charm of someone who has observed what warmth and engagement look like and reproduced those qualities with sufficient accuracy that the reproduction passes as the original in most circumstances. He was intelligent enough to do well in school when he applied himself and to do adequately when he did not, which meant that his academic record communicated inconsistency rather than incapacity, and that the adults in his life tended to characterize his underperformance as untapped potential rather than as a signal of anything more fundamental. He graduated from high school in 1991, spent 2 years at a community college in Knoxville without completing a degree, and took a job at a commercial insurance agency in 1993 where he discovered, with the specific pleasure of someone finding the environment their particular skill set was built for, that the insurance sales floor was a place where charm and the appearance of competence were sufficient to produce success and where the longer-term consequences of his methods were someone else's problem to manage. He met Margaret Pierce in 1995 at a mutual friend's birthday party in Knoxville. Margaret was 24 years old, a registered nurse who had graduated from the University of Tennessee 2 years earlier and who had the particular quality of people who have been competent for so long that it has simply become their register, steady, organized, reliable in a way that did not require effort because it was simply how she moved through the world. She was not naive about people and she was not easily impressed, which meant that Robert's charm did not work on her in the way it worked on most people he encountered, which was, paradoxically, the thing about Margaret that Robert found most attractive, not because he valued the quality of person she was but because winning the regard of someone who was not easily won represented a specific kind of challenge that he found engaging in the early stages of any relationship. They dated for 2 years. Margaret's friends from nursing school had varying assessments of Robert during those 2 years that ranged from genuinely warm to cautiously uncertain, and the cautiously uncertain ones had specific rather than vague reservations. They could not point to a specific dishonesty but they had the feeling, expressed in the language of people who are trying to be fair to someone they are not sure about, that the Robert in front of them and the Robert who existed when Margaret was not present were not quite the same person. Margaret heard these reservations and weighed them and concluded, with the fairness she brought to everything, that what her friends were describing was a quality of social performance that was common in men who had grown up with high expectations and that the Robert she knew in private was different from the Robert who was always performing for a room and that the private one was the real one. She was not entirely wrong about this. She was not entirely right either. They married in September 1997 and settled in Nashville, where Robert had taken a position at a larger insurance firm and where Margaret transferred her nursing license and found a position at a hospital that she would work at for the next 20 years. Nashville was good for both of them in the way that cities are good for people in their late 20s who are building something. There was work and there were people and there was the particular energy of a city growing faster than its infrastructure and producing in that growth the specific kind of opportunity that people who are paying attention can find if they look for it. Robert was paying attention, though not always in the direction that Margaret understood him to be looking. He performed well at the insurance firm through his early 30s, rising to a senior sales position that provided a comfortable income and that he spoke about with the enthusiasm of someone who found the work genuinely satisfying, which he did, not because of the work itself but because of the specific game that insurance sales at a senior level allowed him to play, which was the game of producing trust in large enough quantities and quickly enough that the distance between the trust and its verification remained unexamined. Margaret built her career at the hospital with the steady accumulation of someone who was doing the work because the work mattered and who found, over the years, a position in the cardiac care unit that she was good at and that she understood as the right use of what she was capable of. She bought a house in 2003 with the down payment that came from her savings, in her name and Robert's, in a neighborhood that was already beginning to appreciate in the way that Nashville neighborhoods were beginning to appreciate in 2003, and which by 2017 was worth considerably more than what she had paid for it. She had made the financial decisions of the marriage with the competence she brought to everything, and Robert had participated in those decisions with the enthusiasm of someone who understood the value of what was being built without always fully contributing to its construction. The financial problems began, as best as investigators were later able to reconstruct them, in approximately 2012. Robert had left the insurance firm in 2010 to pursue what he described to Margaret as an independent financial consulting practice that he was building from his existing client relationships, and Margaret had supported this decision with the practical generosity of a person who earned enough to carry the household while the practice was established and who trusted, because she had spent 15 years with a man who appeared to be competent and who had always managed to produce adequate results. When he needed to, that the practice would eventually be what he said it was going to be. The practice was not what he said it was going to be. It was, to the extent that it existed at all, a framework for producing the appearance of professional activity rather than the substance of it, client meetings that produced no clients, consulting agreements that produced no income, a professional persona that was maintained with the charm and organizational surface that Robert was very good at maintaining and that concealed, for a time, the absence of the underlying work. The income gap was covered initially by money from Margaret's savings and then by credit in Robert's name and then in the couple's joint names and then, in the ways that financial problems compound when the person managing them is more interested in concealing them than resolving them, by credit that was in Margaret's name alone, accessed by Robert with the access that a spouse has to a joint financial household and used for purposes that had nothing to do with the household's benefit. By 2014 the financial situation was, by the best reconstruction available to the investigators who later examined it, significantly worse than Margaret knew. Robert had accumulated approximately $240,000 in debt across 9 separate credit accounts, 4 of which were in Margaret's name and 3 of which were in both names and 2 of which were in Robert's name alone. He had not told Margaret about any of these accounts. He had managed the household's bill payments with sufficient care to prevent the notices and statements from reaching Margaret's attention, a task that in the era of online banking and email statements required a specific kind of sustained attention to financial administration that Robert, who had never shown much sustained attention to anything, maintained with a consistency that he never applied to anything legitimate. Margaret knew the household's finances were tight in the way that she had always known things in their shared life, by paying attention to the available information and trusting that the information she was seeing was the full picture. It was not the full picture. Robert had been managing her view of the picture for 2 years at that point and had become, with practice, quite good at it. She noticed, in the spring of 2014, that their savings account balance was lower than she expected it to be, and she asked Robert about it, and Robert produced an explanation involving a tax payment and a consulting expense and a timing issue with a client payment that was expected the following month, and the explanation was specific enough and delivered with sufficient confidence that Margaret accepted it, and the following month brought another explanation and the month after that brought another, and by the time Margaret understood clearly that the explanations were not explanations but management, Robert had had 2 more years to manage. He met Cheryl Dawson in 2015 at a real estate investment seminar in Nashville that he had attended, according to the account he gave Cheryl in the early weeks of their acquaintance, because he was looking to expand his financial consulting practice into real estate advisory services. Cheryl was 38 years old, a recently divorced dental hygienist from Phoenix who had moved to Nashville 6 months earlier following her divorce and who was attending the seminar because she had received a settlement in the divorce that included the equity from the sale of the marital home, approximately $180,000, and who had been told by the attorney who handled her divorce that she should invest it carefully and that a real estate seminar was a reasonable place to begin educating herself about her options. Robert Calloway and Cheryl Dawson sat at adjacent tables during the lunch break of the seminar. Robert was charming in the way he was always charming, specific, attentive, interested in what she said in the way that makes people feel that their words are being received rather than merely heard. Cheryl was, by her own later account, aware that he was charming in the specific way and not entirely credulous about what that meant. She was also, by her own later account, lonely in the specific way that people are lonely when they have recently lost the primary relationship of their adult life and are in a new city and have not yet built the network of connections that makes a new city feel like somewhere rather than nowhere. Robert understood loneliness, he was very good at identifying it and at positioning himself as its solution. They exchanged numbers at the end of the seminar. He called her 2 days later. She answered. What Cheryl knew about Robert Calloway in the first year of knowing him was the version of himself that he constructed for her with the same careful attention he brought to all his constructions. He was a financial consultant with a growing independent practice. He was in a marriage that had been effectively over for years but from which he was legally extracting himself as quickly as the process allowed, a characterization that was technically partially true in the sense that his marriage was in serious difficulty, though the difficulty was his creation rather than a mutual dissolution. He was interested in real estate investment and thought that Cheryl's settlement represented an excellent foundation for the kind of portfolio building that he had been helping clients with for years. He was available to her in the specific and consistent way that people who are managing a double life are sometimes available to its secondary portion, because the secondary portion is where the attention is not regulated by history and expectation and the accumulated weight of a real relationship but is instead the place where the person can be whoever they have decided to be without the corrections that long familiarity produces. Cheryl found him thoughtful and knowledgeable and genuinely interested in her in a way that her marriage, which had deteriorated over a decade into the specific coldness of two people who had stopped paying attention to each other, had not produced. She trusted his advice. She invested $40,000 of her settlement in a real estate fund that he recommended. The fund returned 8% in the first year. This was the first year. The first year was the hook. Robert Calloway began what investigators would later call the exit plan in approximately January 2016. It was not a single plan with a single design but a set of parallel preparations that he advanced simultaneously over the following 14 months, preparations that were individually unremarkable in most of their components and that only revealed their collective purpose in retrospect. He opened a bank account in Phoenix in February 2016 using a form of identification that was not his own, a reconstructed identity built around a social security number belonging to a deceased person, a practice that is more difficult than it was before the widespread digitization of government records but that remains possible for someone with the right combination of patience and resources and willingness to operate in the specific gray markets where such identities are assembled. He opened the account under the name David Marsh. Over the following 14 months he transferred money into the David Marsh account from sources that included withdrawals from the joint accounts he shared with Margaret, transfers that were small enough, individually, to avoid the automated flagging that larger movements would have triggered and frequent enough that their cumulative amount over 14 months was substantial. He told Cheryl in the fall of 2016 that his divorce proceedings were reaching their final stage and that he would be relocating to Phoenix in the spring of 2017, which was where he intended to establish the next phase of his professional practice and where, he said, he hoped she would be willing to be part of building that next phase with him. Cheryl said she was willing. She had been back in Phoenix since the beginning of 2016, having found Nashville, without him present more days than not, less compelling than she had expected. She had bought a house there with the remaining proceeds of her divorce settlement, a house with a mortgage whose payments she was managing on her dental hygienist's salary, a house that became, in early 2017, the destination Robert was building toward. Margaret Calloway began to understand the full scope of what had been done to her in pieces, not all at once, and the pieces arrived in an order that was specifically designed by Robert to produce maximum confusion and minimum time for clear-headed response. The truck at the lake was found on April 3, 2017, by a fisherman who noted the open door and the wallet and the phone and called the county sheriff's department, which dispatched a deputy who examined the scene and called the Nashville Metropolitan Police Department, which dispatched a detective who called Margaret Calloway at the hospital where she was working the morning shift and told her that her husband's truck had been found at the edge of a lake in rural Tennessee with evidence suggesting he may have gone into the water. The detective was careful with his language because careful language is what the situation required at that stage. The truck and its contents were consistent with a voluntary disappearance or with an accident, and the detective did not know which he was dealing with and said so. Margaret left the hospital and drove to the lake and stood at the edge of it and looked at the truck and at the water and understood none of it, which was the specific and intended result of the staging Robert had spent 3 weeks preparing. She spent the following days in the particular helplessness of someone who does not know whether to grieve or to wait and who is therefore suspended between the two in a state that is its own specific kind of suffering.